Okay, thanks, Mostafa. Hi, everybody who's joined. This is Dawn Hocevar, President and CEO of BioCT, and we are launching a webinar series from our board of directors. And Mostafa is our first one kicking off the new series for us. Thank you very much, Mostafa. And I'm going to let you just go ahead and introduce yourself, etc.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Kelly, if you can, do you have anything else to show other than that opening?
Very quickly, I just wanted to take one moment on behalf of BioCT and our directors to thank our sponsors, Boehringer Ingelheim, Pfizer, UConn, and Yale, our legacy partners. And then our additional organizational sponsors, Alexion, Aon Markham, Strategic Spaces, Connecticut Innovations, Medtronic, Semaphore, and Wigan and Dana. Thank you all very much. And Mostafa, I'm happy to stop sharing and turn it over to you.
Thank you. I'm going to put my slides there and start the conversation. Thank you very much, Don Kelly, for organizing this. And as Don mentioned, this is a new series that BioCT has created. And the intent is allow board of director members to share different topics with the audience. And knowing the board and the composition of the board, I think this is going to be a wonderful series. There are such a diverse set of expertise and thinking there. The only bad thing is I'm the first one, so don't take that as a quality of stuff that you get to see. So to get the conversation started, my focus here is just to give you a flavor of the landscape of investment on a private side of investment too, for early to mid-stage companies. But I have to say a few words about public market. And I have included that disclosure on the bottom that I will reference some securities, some particular ticker symbols. And by no means that's a recommendation for any action. This is just an informal conversation. And also understand this is being recorded, and considering what's happening in the market, by the time you listen to parts of this conversation, that might be an old news for you. Having said that, let's get it started. I'd like to share with you three specific topics. One is the overview of the ecosystem. And this would be a very quick overview. For some of you that have been in the market, this might be very trivial, but I think it's important to set the table as how the second part, the private capital snapshot describes. And I must thank you, Silicon Valley Bank, that has been a great resource for the data that I'm going to share with you. I'm a very quantitative person, and any opinion I provide, I'd like to be backed by some data. And Silicon Valley Bank is among, as well as National Venture Capital Association, they are really doing outstanding work to capture that data. The last part is I want to go over this market entanglement, private and public capital, and that's a finicky part of the presentation. I have to be very careful what I say and make sure, and I have just a single point to make there, and I'll mention that when I get there. I'm not going to go through market analysis followed by Q&A that we have. Specifically, there are two areas that I'm not going to get into, are important, no time to get into. One is the M&A, what happened last year, what is changing. Unfortunately, we didn't have JP Morgan in person this year, and that's where a lot of transactions and discussion starts. By the time we come back from JP Morgan, you probably have a sense of what's going to happen in the next 6 months, 9 months. And the other one that I will not go over, another important issue, show you some data, IPO performance. And those would be really important topic that requires another session. Just to put things into context, from our work perspective at UConn, we do have a number of one-on-one meetings. These are one-on-one private meetings with investors. ranging from angels to VCs to investment bankers. Those are specifically related to UConn startups in our incubator. But occasionally, because of the topics, we bring a group of people together to educate and inform the broader public. And BioCT has been involved in this. I put up two of the most recent one that we did. This is unique because I'm the only speaker, but generally this is done by multiple speakers because of diversity that we have there. Looking at the picture that you see on the lower left was from almost a year and a half ago. And you see a combination of VCs and private equities and fund of funds. And the one on the upper right was from last summer in the middle of COVID that BioCT co-organized it with us. Again, same combination of angels, VCs, as well as investment banks. You probably will notice two different things. One is the impact of COVID. I used to look like that before COVID. Now that's me today. The other one is when I say we collectively, are very, very focused on increasing diversity in our ecosystem. You can see that we had a major problem in our first composition of group about a year and a half ago. And this is an issue that we are taking on. Actually, BioCT has made this as one of the cornerstone of its activity, and Erica Smith, as well as a number of others, are taking the lead on that. Stay tuned. Don and BioCT will have more information. We have been a very great supporter, and we remain very optimistic that we can move the ball forward. We have a long way to go, but I remain very optimistic. So just a quick, this is my cartoon description of the ecosystem in life sciences in US. And it's very valuable in a sense because I presented this several years ago in Europe and Asia. And then why, if we take this as a trivial matter, it's so trivial that you don't need to even read the caption. It makes sense. Just to summarize it, research, the discovery happens through different channels, whether it's corporate money, government money, university money, and it leads to early stage biotechs, assuming that some of them get licensed directly to the larger one. And a number of them will die, a few of them survive. Of the surviving biotech, again, we have direct acquisition to the larger players, the IPO path, and those will create products, product revenues, jobs, taxes, and taxes goes back to this cycle, and the cycle continues. It seems very trivial. The discussion that I had in Europe 6-7 years ago, they tried to replicate this model, and same thing in Asia. And I would say that success has been limited. And the more we dug into that, it's not about the capital market or just the university system. It's to some extent a factor that we don't consider, but it's there. And that's the cultural aspect that creates environment like this and makes it sustainable. And this is the part which is hard to quantify and pinpoint. But to me, that's the part, by culture, I'm refer to a very, very large set of elements within that ecosystem that makes this model effective, as well as resilient to some of the major shaking that happens in the system. Go back to 2008 and 9, that financial tsunami could have destroyed this model very easily, but it survived and it's coming back stronger than before. So some of the key questions that, if you're early to mid stage companies that you always have in mind and investors want to look at, listen from you, is where you are and where are you going in terms of both science, portfolio, and the product. You need to fully understand, especially where you are going and how far you're going to go stick with it. I'm always baffled when I see a young scientist come up with a new molecular entity that has some in vitro assay indicating potential activities. And he says that I want to take it to the full market. go to the market, to the patient, produce and distribute this. While scientifically it's exciting, that's a red flag of this person probably has no clue what it takes to get there. That's why knowing where you want to go is important in terms of what investment you need to do. And this painful discussion of how low can you go on the valuation cycle, which is another one that you have to be aware of. Especially last year was a weird year because it was the opposite way of, it was really a seller's market last year. But I don't expect that to last very long. The other key element that is both valuable in pharma as medtech is that crossing of the chasm, innovation chasm. This is the model you probably heard from others. I borrowed it from Norman model that he put it in his, and this is my modification that I have the model, but basic concept comes from him. Under time axis, you have time. On the vertical axis, you have relative percentage of users, patients, customers. You know, we innovators just start from here because they have something shiny. They're excited about it. For an innovator, 2 experiments done by a graduate student is the final evidence this is going to work for everyone, everywhere. But in reality, it takes time to have those adoption. Adoption in pharmaceutical is much slower, and to some extent is a binary event because whatever preclinical, clinical data you have is not that meaningful until you have that FDA payers crossover to happen. And this chasm gets shifted. This is a virtual or imaginary wall here that goes left and right depending on your medtech, DX, digital diagnostics, or others. And the key issue is going through this and eventually into the market. This is what I call the push and pull of the market. And most of our conversation today is on the push side of the equation. Now, if you take that and map it to what is in drug development terminology, we have those pathfinding research and development. Pathfinding, by the way, is referred to, you know, you have something, identify a new protein that has certain interaction with cells, but I don't know what that means in terms of clinical application. And then you go through the research and while you get there. The other thing that I want to point, you know, although this chart was created as a linear process, you start here, you get there, but in reality, it's a lot of recursive, iterative process of learning, going back. What working the dog does not work in the human, all right, you got to go back. And what you work in a small population for your clinical development, suddenly you see a lot of unusual toxicity in the larger population, you got to go back to work. So from relevant to today's conversation is the capital market impacting on the push side of the equation, both for medical devices as well as the therapeutics. You have heard about this valley of death, which is almost like a imaginary feeble. And valley of death means different things to other people. You know, valley of death on the drug development players, early versus late stage, seed versus institutional level. If you're into diagnostics or biomarker development, that you are in here, the discovery side, here's a, you know, you have a fabulous biomarker that shows some plaque activity in the brain, but is it accepted as something as a diagnostic tool for Alzheimer? There is a huge valley between these two. You know, we see all these genomic signatures that are discovered, scientifically exciting. Is it actionable item? And FIPCO, this is fully integrated pharmaceutical company, meaning that like a big pharma that does soup to nuts of everything from discovery to the clinical development and manufacturing and distribution versus to the virtual or vertically integrated model. And the other one is disease management versus health management, which is becoming very popular. So value of death is real. How wide it is and where it is, it depends on who you are and what you are focusing on. The other reality, especially, this is an old slide that I borrowed about the complexity of drug development. I just want to, on the top, you can see the different stages of biology, chemistry, development, everything that happens in this side of equation labeled as a research, and this is clinical development, and it's going to continue beyond that, beyond that line. What I'd like to point to you is this area here that maps to the top line, and the numbers that you see on the bottom is the probability of success in each of those activities. Now, probability of success in the target identification is 19%, target validation 20%, 23%, and you keep going. And for those who are mathematicians into statistics, when you have multiple sequential phenomena, the ultimate probability is multiplication of all these probabilities. And that's why the chance of success gets so low in this process. And on top of that, the gray area is the cost of failure, blue is the cost of success. And again, vast majority of drug development on the average is labeled as a failure. Failure, that meaning that, phase 2, phase 3 did not meet the expected outcome, and you've got to go back and start from scratch. Many of you may have heard about this. This is the famous Tufts data set that Tufts University Center for Study of Drug Development runs this kind of studies every few years, and it has become sort of like a gold standard for the cost analysis. Last time they did that, a few years ago, they came back with the average cost of drug development is about $2 billion. There are a lot of footprints that you got to see that, but essentially in their models, they look into the new molecular entity, not just the new indication for existing compounds. And this is the data that they put together based on analysis they have done in the time period of 95, 2007 FDA approval. Again, these are the transitional probability of going from phase 1 to phase 2 is almost 60%. It's a large number, but bear in mind that a lot of other failures, probability needs to be adjusted before you get to phase 1, and probability that goes after it, such as phase 2, 3, NDA, BLA refers to biologic licensing application, which is essentially, do you have a small molecule versus biologics? And when you add up from phase 1 to NDA, we are talking about less than 12% probability of success. Again, I highly suggest to consider that there were some other probabilities that need to be adjusted. And one more painful fact is getting FDA clearance doesn't mean that you're going to sell enough of that to recover the cost of development. That's another. And this is probably in defense of pharma that when there's an objection why this pill is going to cost this much, you have to look at the entire cost continuum and include the cost of failure in the pricing that goes with it. So I mentioned that this is a quick recap of sources of capital. You can see for yourself there are wide ranges of sources, and we have seen individuals that start from their own monies, although it's becoming increasingly difficult in pharma, in the therapeutic development to do that. On the digital health, still I see some players that start from scratch there. And you can go from, depending on the complexity. The topics that are highlighted in bold, those are the only one that I'm going to discuss today, and the other one is just their FII. This is another way of looking at that continuum and the labeling that we have for angel, seed, startup versus growth. This is not a standard terminology, but that tells you when the role of angels typically starts. Maybe we go into the institutionals, and then the crossover funds come in, then mezzanine funds coming, followed by the public market. And that is a crazy thing, because here's the model. This is the conventional model that everybody accepted until last year. You go to your seed financing, followed by at least a couple, 2 or 3 institutional Series A, B, C, followed by a crossover / mezzanine, then IPO, and it was short-circuited last year. We have seen jumping from Series A to the public market, which is very, very unusual. Back to the structures, you can do a non-equity investment, any kind of convertible debts or covered debt, senior debt, those are all possibilities on the left side, and then equity financing that comes with it. And the focus here is on the equity financing. On the non-diluting one, I think many of them are familiar to. You have state and government organizations. Foundations are increasingly getting engaged in this area. And the Gates Foundation, with tens of billions of dollars, actively are giving grants, and starting a few years ago, they are taking equity in the company, which is quite unusual. Like JDRF, which is Juvenile Diabetes Research Foundation, same thing. They are a granting organization. They used to give grant for scientists working on type 1 diabetes. But then they started adding this footprint that they're called it venture development type of money, that legally you're not obligated to give anything back. But when you are successful, we would like you to consider giving the principal back plus some. And on the bottom, the prize models, X Prize has been there. I don't know you heard about that or not. The next one is going to be $100 million carbon capture prize. I have participated in Nokia Challenge in the past. It was about point of care diagnostics that at least 3 companies got a total of $5 million on that, plus the validation of their technologies. I mentioned about the government agencies. You all heard about SBIR, STTR. It comes in 2 phases of funding. That phase 1 could be up to $250K. Phase 2 could be almost $1.5 million. There is a phase 3 in their terminology, but there is no money associated with that. And some of the agencies also have the matching fund. This is the pie chart of distribution of funding, SBIR versus STTR. As you can see, SBIR is much larger pool. STTR has an academic angle. The other one I'd like to highlight is DoD and NASA are more on the contract side rather than grant. Many Connecticut companies have been successful getting NIH, NSF type of funding, and DOE also in non-life sciences have been very effective. The question that always comes up, what's the impact of this money? Is it worth it? The slide that you see, I borrowed it from NSF group. This is a colleague of mine shared with me at NSF. And this is what they use to say, yes, and as the SBIR money is effective. And these are the name of companies that started at the beginning and use SBIR money to get there. And you can see 23andMe, Illumina, Biogen on the life sciences. Qualcomm, I personally saw their growth in Southern California, just in San Diego. This is amazing that how they start from that little place and what they have built so far around them. So there is no question that there is impact. Now, on ROI basis, it's very difficult for government to make the point. But my question to you as entrepreneur, as a CEO, is it worth it for you to use this as your primary mode of financing? I stress that primary mode of financing, which I do have some hesitation. We can discuss that later on. Before I jump into the VC market, a quick note on the angel investors. They are very active. Last year, they had a very good year. Some of the numbers, this is from the annual report of ACA. Typically angel groups invest about $2.5 million a year. That tells you the size of investment. There are angels that do much more than that, and then there are angels that do much less than that. But generally, they start on the low end of valuation. They state that although they come at early stage and invest a little money, they added value and the multiplier is huge for them. And that's the value they provide. And on the lower right corner, you can see that where they are specializing. Several angels specifically shy away from biotechnology, especially drug development, knowing the time horizon and the capital requirement. And there are very few that are specializing in that domain. I am going to pick up the pace here, but I want to leave some time at the end for Q&A. And this is the quick data set I want to share with you and get to that last comment of public versus private entanglement. This is the chart that shows how much VCs raised money. This is not company, how much money funds raised last year. Those are the VCs that eventually invest. You can see that the annual growth, sometimes we had spot up and down, but what happened last year was just unbelievable. And we have not seen anything like that since 2008. It's gone up by almost 60%. Some of these funds that you can see there might be familiar to you. Just to highlight RA Capital, which is based in Boston. So this is a crossover fund that does do private as well as public investment. Flagship Pioneering, if you don't know, that is the fund that Noubar Afeyan created a few years ago. And if you don't remember, this is the fund that created Moderna. Noubar and Doug Cole were the original investors in Moderna. And I do remember we had sort of like a reception 4 years ago in Cambridge. And Noubar was saying that, look, Moderna is a really high-risk project on mRNA, and we are not anticipating any product anytime soon. But you can see that they were on the right track, and they had that right platform to convert that platform in such a short notice to a major vaccine that is playing a role here. And the other plays like NEA, they have gone just berserk in terms of size of funding. I believe the last round they had was over $2 billion. And that adds to the first frustration of early stage companies when they said, look, your ask is too small for us. You know, when you have a $2 billion fund, how many $1 million, $5 million, $10 million can you invest? Which is completely getting out of whack in the system. The other question comes up, all right, where does the money go in terms of different aspects? The key color coding that you see on the lower left, is biopharma, health tech, DX, and tools devices. And you can see the same kind of, this is quarterly comparison that you can see that third quarter of last year was amazing for the companies receiving investment. Traditionally, as you can see here, fourth quarter is the quiet year. Everybody's gearing up for the holidays and perhaps the beginning. A lot of discussion happens in the fourth quarter, but transactions start trickling down in the first quarter. But look at the numbers on the pharma side, 24 billion versus 15 last year. And the surprising part, which I should say it's not surprising, is the diagnostic tools at 10 versus 5, almost double. Medical devices in some areas, in fact, they moved backward. In general, they raised more money. And that's a topic for question. What happened to medical devices last year? Why there was less attention to them? And I think now that you're looking back, we have the hindsight, we have some understanding. So within pharma, you may ask, all right, which are the ones that are getting most of money? Oncology has been number one for a number of years, continue. Platform was a not favorite terminology until recently. If you say I'm a platform company, then you gotta wait in the line for others, but suddenly it became popular, followed by neurology and orphan disease area. Because of the time, I'm not going to say much about orphan disease area, except just pointing out probably ALS is the number one, followed by Huntington disease. and others such as Rett syndrome and Fragile X. I keep following on that because we have Alexion Estate, we have Rally Bio. This is something that we have local interest in them. Now, going back to the biopharma deals, these are deals, M&A deals, not the investments that you can see again on terms of oncology, what's happening. The darker green here shows 2020, and proportionally you can see how much growth that we have had in those areas. Orphan diseases still appears there. There has been some transaction. This does not include Alexion transaction. We are looking into private companies at this point. And the other one I want to draw your attention is this column here, the pre-money valuation of those transactions, and look at how many unicorns or super unicorns have popped up. You know, I thought unicorns did not exist. Then we start believing that sometimes maybe one or two unicorns out there. Now I think we are flooded with unicorn in this area. And the other one is who are the most active based on the number of transactions, not necessarily dollar size, in different categories. You can see the venture capital versus corporate investors and later stage investors right there. I already mentioned RA Capital as a crossover fund that exists there. And you can see Citadel, that typically is considered as a hedge fund. They are moving into a sector that has unique characteristics for them. The other ones that I want to highlight here, and I have to look at it carefully, that here, Osage University partner, they did a lot of investment, not necessarily on the high side. Omega Fund based on London, the same thing. They did a lot of investment, but not necessarily at the big side. Now, Morningside Capital is quite interesting because the core of the group is based on China, but they have offices on the East Coast and invest in US. And the number shows that there has been significant uptick on Chinese headquarter funds that invest in US. And this is despite some of the bad political relationship. And I wonder how it's going to evolve in the new administration. Looking at the IPOs, this is another baffling and surprising numbers that you can see how, if I'm looking at this part of the equation here, that you can see the number of IPOs. It is definitely, we have not seen these numbers in the past 4 years. You can see their performances. One thing that I want to highlight here, the light blue is the late stage IPOs, late stage companies that had IPO. The darker is early stage. And you can see the bifurcation here, which is unusual that in terms of performance, that even early stages are taking over. These are some of the, I think, topics that hopefully we can discuss what happened to the capital market. Now, one more thing, and I want to speed up here to finish this section, is when you compare this, let's look at the top portion of this, that this is Silicon Valley Bank, a post-IPO performance comparison, and they have compared different categories. The purplish color is NASDAQ. I'll come back to that. FAMGA is Facebook, Amazon, Microsoft, Google, and Apple. All right, so if you take all of them and clump them together and take the average of that, and they ended up being here, while the healthcare IPOs are here. Now, we all saw what happened in this FMGA composition, and it's still a biotech, early stage biotech outperformed them. Again, another unusual performance. Before I wrap up this story, I mentioned this before, I want to bring it up. This is another metric that I paid a lot of attention, has nothing to do with the financial numbers, the diversity of workforce within venture domain. And we have some colleagues both in New York and in Boston, we bring up this topic. And this is a recent study that was done with NVCA the study was published in 2019, but captures data for 2018. And now, as we're speaking, they're collecting 2020 data. So we should be able to see that soon. You can see that relative to 2016-18, there are some small, some large uptick, but we are nowhere close to the parity that we are targeting. So I would say it's moving in the right path, maybe not fast enough, but it's encouraging that all that efforts are working well. And as I mentioned, BioCT is leading this and putting on the agenda as one of the major objectives. And Dawn and her team will have more to say. The last comment that I want to mention is this private-public capital entanglement, because I hear sometimes from early stage companies that are looking for seed investment, and the CEO says, how do I care about what happens in IPO or public market? I'm looking for my first money. Oh, by the way, for those of you who are interested in the graphics, that's a quantum entanglement, borrowed from the quantum physics. And you may not believe it, quantum physics is more manageable in terms of understanding than public capital market. So here's the thing, where does the money come into the VC domain? Who are the LPs in the VC side? And I have put these in place for you to give you the composition of where do they get their monies, whether it's a public, private, pension funds, endowments, individuals and families, and some of them are public information. For example, Michael Dell, his family is one of the providers of that kind of capital. Same thing with Bill Gates. He does have a family fund that puts money into the VCs. And no matter what kind of retirement plan you have, most likely part of your retirement is entangled to VC capital. The other question is, how do they decide how much of that money goes to the VC part of the equation? This is called asset allocation, and every endowment or retirement fund have to go through this. Unfortunately, I cannot share with you some of the confidential distribution, but Yale was generous enough to make it publicly known how they allocate their endowment money. And these are based on, the key decision making for an asset manager endowment is, what are my target in terms of return? What are the institutional priorities? Like in case of Yale, they have made it clear that environment is one of their priorities, so they can put money there. And then based on that, they divide and distribute it based on different risk that they have. Probably the venture capital is the highest risk class, and 24% allocation is on the very high end of allocation. The average allocation of fund is around 7 to 8%. So this gives you a flavor of where does the money come to the VCs and how the fund managers, these are endowment retirement fund managers, decide. Now the challenge here is some of the money, as you can see, are in the absolute return cash or bond. Bond, for most practical purposes, are considered as good as cash. It has a very little fluctuation. But as a fund manager, let's say that if you decide to have 10% of your assets on the special class of venture capital, and at the end of the day, a lot of these assets will change the valuation. Cash, you know it well, how much you have. Those who are in the public market, by 4 o'clock, you know what you have. And if there is sudden changes, the only place that you don't know what's going on immediately is the venture valuation. And when the public market suddenly goes up, as it has been going through the past few years, suddenly you feel that you are under allocating there. Perhaps that explains sudden rush of VC funds collections last year. And if you remember 2008 and 9, we had the reverse situation that public valuations went down significantly, but private assets were not revalued. And we paid for it in the next 2 or 3 years after that until it catch up. So for the sake of argument, this is not a public market analysis. I have created 3 different scenarios, and I want to leave it with you on this one and wrap up the presentation part. I took just this is an example, this to make the point. The pink line that you see is the NASDAQ index, broad NASDAQ index, not a subsector. The blue one is the NASDAQ NASDAQ Biotechnology Index. You can do the same thing with S&P 500 or any other index that you would prefer. Now, I chose December 2012 to January 2021. There is a reason for that. It covers 2 sets of administration roughly. And then in the next slide, I'm going to divide this in 2 parts. One is the first 4 years, 2012 to 2017. Now, is December of 12 to January of 17. Again, go back to the shift of electoral shift, and that's the rationale. And this is the performance then. Again, back pink is the general NASDAQ, blue is the index. And you can see the bifurcation that is started at the beginning of that era. There seemed to be some favoritism of the market that biotech is going to do well. And you know why that happens. When the government is starting investing money and providing insurance and covering a lot of uncovered individuals, suddenly market expanded suddenly. And then this created an issue here. I remember I had the data up to this point that you see, and I was speaking at an event in Cambridge. It was a Harvard MIT event. And I put this slide up to here. Of course, I could not, sorry, I was up to here. I could not see the rest of it. I did not have that futuristic view. And my point there was, when the market is start deviating this much, generalists will stop walking into the biotech domain, and then it causes either soft correction or rapid correction. I had no idea which one is going to happen, but definitely a correction was coming. And that was the correction. Many of you in the market will not forget that. That was more than 30% correction in a few weeks. And then the bifurcation started again, followed by the correction. So this was that, and I'm going to move you to the 4 years since then. By the way, these are relative numbers, not actual NASDAQ numbers. What I've done is taking the beginning line, I normalize the data so you can see the relative change in the behavior. Now we have the opposite situation, that NASDAQ has created that bifurcation. And there will be a shift of capital from one side to the other side of the equation, plus some of uncertainty. I don't know if you have been following the market, especially with this crazy stuff happening with GameStop or Nokia and other stuff. I think there will be some, not only correction, some uncertainty to come. I want to stop here and leave you with these questions. And the one key question is this private capital train sustainable? I believe, this is my view, and again, supported by evidence, there is need for adjustment. But what I don't know is it going to be a soft correction or a choppy one? But what does all these mean to you if you're a CEO and raising capital, looking at what's the market, what should be your priority, especially when it comes to your valuation when you hit the market? With that in mind, I am going to stop here and give it back to Don and Kelly and any other questions that others may have. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very, very much, Mostafa. Yeah, if you have questions, please put them into the chat box. And Mostafa, there is a question here. What is the data source for the VC funding?
Most of the data that I showed to you, and I should have labeled it, my apologies, comes from Silicon Valley Bank. This is the part of the data that they publicly disclose. I believe by now the data must be on their website. If not, you can do 2 things. Either give it a few more days before they put it on their website, or not. If you're really, really in rush to get it, just send me a note. Again, they have no problem sharing this data. What I like about Silicon Valley Bank, they are really, really meticulous with the quality of data. They want to make sure it's really clean and defensible. Now, there was other information from National Venture Capital Association. Everything that I shared with you, I am allowed to discuss publicly. So you can have access to that data as well.
Thank you, Mostafa. Another question, what is the trend for the longevity of the industry?
Well, that's a tough question. I don't know if I can answer that question well, but can I take a rain check on that? Because I don't want to blabber things, but it's a really difficult question, and I don't think I'm prepared to answer that question.
All righty, thank you. Another question, what is the trend in 3D bioprinting?
Wow, that's a good one. So if you look at 3D printing by itself, that became a fad about 6-7 years ago. This is beyond bioscience. And then it went to retraction. Almost all the investors that put money into 3D printing did not get their principal back. But then the market started telling them, what is it that I am looking for? Either on the high margin business of it. Plastic printing, yes, everybody get a 3D printer at home, but the winners of that turn out to be high margin printers, not so much of that. Now, coming back on the 3D printing in bio, essentially there are multiple subsectors that we're discussing here. One is 3D printing of active ingredients and encapsulation. This would be medication on demand. I know that CVS has looked into that. Rather than stockpiling so much medication, can we do formulation, the old-fashioned formulation that used to be hand to be done by 3D printing. So that's one end of the spectrum that is quite reasonable. The higher end of the spectrum is 3D printing for tissues. UConn has hired a new faculty member recently. That he was part of the cohort of Mass General Harvard researchers that now is scattered around the country. The core of the group is at UCLA as we speak. And those are one of the most promising area. We have also in orthopedics within UConn, there are activities around that. Now, coming back to your question, for most of material-based 3D printing in bio, we are at the product stage. But when it comes to tissue, even I don't want to get into organ discussion, we are at a very exciting stage, but too early to call the shot on that.
Thank you very much, Mostafa. So another question would, considering the rapid growth in capital raised by VCs, what are the key drivers and do you think it's sustainable?
I think now that we have enough time to digest it, and I have spoken with some of the funds, especially the LPs, there is no doubt that two key drivers for what happened last year. One was the capital market. You saw it's going on much faster than the average, and that creates the imbalance into the LP funds. The second one is the cheap money out there. If you look at Federal Reserve, the interest rate, the money's almost, there's not much cost for money. And if you are trying to invest anything from government bond to high yield debt, it's very challenging for the fund managers to make money. And now they are shifting that money to high risk assets such as VC. So now that we have seen the data, we know exactly what happened. In terms of sustainability, again, the consensus is this is not going to continue. You're not going to see another 60% year over year on the VC investment. But the good news for early stage companies is now there is much stronger dry powder within the VC domain to sustain some market correction that could happen in a year or two.
Thank you. I think we have time for another question here. What about the M&A landscape? What does it look like for 2021?
That's interesting, but I didn't get a chance to get to that, to share with you the data. The primary mode of M&A, as you know, is when you get to some inflection point, whether you're therapeutics or medical devices, a large corporate player will come and take the transaction. Because of that rapid point of entry to IPO, the price of M&A has gone up so much that, in fact, M&A with big corporation went down slightly relative to the IPO, which is, again, another unusual performance. Having said that, I think we're going to have some realistic repricing of these assets. And I feel that M&A will come back strongly within pharma, definitely within pharma and diagnostics. But medical devices, as I mentioned, still some question marks there. If you remember, the data showed that the investment in medical devices in early stage actually reduced. In overall, there was some slight increase. And I believe this is based on the collective understanding that the COVID restrictions heavily impacted their distribution, R&D, and product development last year.
Interesting. Thank you. All right, one last question here. What do you think 2020's performance, how was it impact availability of funds for 2021?
Looking at the crystal ball, huh?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think if you look at some of the professional opinions come up, I want to avoid giving you my personal opinion, so I'm going to mention the professionals and the fund managers. The way they are looking at portfolio rebalancing, it's clear that they are not expecting the same performance as last year. And the other question for the VCs are, how rapidly do you want to deploy the capital? To me, the major unknown is this instability in the public market, that soft versus choppy correction. And unfortunately, that's going to happen. Don't know when and how, but I hope that will be mainly a soft, rational correction. Irrational behaviors happen in the market, which you cannot explain. Yesterday, GameStop was up by 60%? And this morning was down by 26%. This doesn't happen in the market on a daily basis. And I think we need some time for market to settle down and find a strong signal within the noise that we have around there. The other thing that I didn't get a chance to discuss is the SPACs, the special purpose companies that are coming on board. They were on the quiet mode for a number of years, and suddenly SPACs are coming back so strongly that I doubt that they can sustain that level of investment going into next year and the year after.
Great. Well, Mostafa, thank you so very much for your time. It was extremely informative. If anybody has further questions, please let BioCT know, and we'll be sure to get them to Mostafa. And thank you all for coming. And this is just the first of our series from our board of directors, and sharing information that their skill sets and their experience and expertise to share with all of you. So thank you so much. Thank you for supporting BioCT, and we wish you all a terrific day, and be safe out there. Thank you. Bye-bye.